Welcome to the Exoduscry podcast, where we have honest conversations around exploitation, trafficking, sexual culture, and justice.
I'm excited about the release of Buying Her, our film that covers the demand side of trafficking.
I think the first film ever made, or the first documentary on this topic, which is really exciting.
It's the first feature-length documentary that I know of that has been done on this subject. Typically, people who are involved in the purchase of sex, people that we often refer to as Johns, prefer to remain anonymous. What we have learned from survivors is that most of these men are married men. So it would make sense that they wouldn't want to openly share, their exploits. Although side point, there's a book written by Victor Malarick called The Johns, I believe, right? Yeah, The Johns. And he cites like some of the conversations on these message boards. So they're very bold in contexts where they believe they have anonymity. But apart from that, they are the silent, anonymous, hidden character in this whole larger equation of human trafficking. And so we felt like it was very important to highlight the stories of these men. And in 2012, we began pre-production and set out to see if we could find some men that would be willing to share their story. And to our amazement, we were able to find about 12 men who decided to open up and to share their story with us. For their part, I thought that was very courageous. And so Buying Her provides a very powerful, unseen kind of insight into who these men are, their lives, their journeys, their stories. And it's really important to understand those things if we hope to continue to address the issue of human trafficking and hopefully eradicate it from our world.
Yeah, I think is so important and imperative, and still in so many anti-trafficking circles, the topic of demand isn't really brought up that much. And so this film just feels like it's putting a spotlight. As you say, the men go on camera, they're showing their faces. All of them, I think it's important to mention, they're all former sex buyers. And so that even gives some of them the boldness and frank honesty to share, because several of them have been out of that lifestyle for years and years. Some of them are now in the prevention space working with other men. And so they themselves want more education on sex buyers and how they get there, and their journey, in order to understand who are these men, what is their motivations, and how do we shift mindsets and behaviors. And so I mean, I've had feedback from people saying, like, how did you find these guys willing to go on camera? Like, what was that whole process like, interviewing these men? And were there things that surprised you that came out of those interviews? Like, when you think back to that production process, like, what was it like sitting in front of these guys and hearing their stories?
Well, let me just say first that this focus on the demand side of the equation is very controversial, even in this quote unquote anti-trafficking space.
So wild. But
yeah,
true.
It's wild. So for us as an organization, at one point, we decided to stop identifying as a anti-trafficking organization and began to call ourselves an abolition organization, because we're interested in getting to the root causes that's fueling this. So I was speaking at this media event, and it was we were doing a partnership with Major League Baseball, and we were having this media event to talk about this thing that we were doing and to raise awareness about human trafficking. And they asked me to share on the subject of how do we end this. And so on the call with the PR person, I said, oh, that's easy. I talk about that all the time. We'll just talk about demand, the male demand for prostitution. And the PR person was like, oh, they're like, well, we can't have you talk about that because one of these other organizations has requested that that not be spoken about? Now, this organization, they told me the name of the organization, is one of the largest elite anti-trafficking organizations in the world. This organization did not want me to talk about ending trafficking from the standpoint of addressing male demand because they felt that was too controversial.
Wow.
And so for me, and I know for you as well, like we got into this not because we thought it was a good idea or when we were, going through the job fair in high school, decided I want to go fight trafficking. We didn't sign up to anti-trafficking university. This was a calling like this. And it was something that our hearts at one point became awakened to the suffering of people who are trapped in trafficking situations. And like, I love that quote by Wilberforce where he says, if to be alive to the suffering of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic, I'm one of the most incurable fanatics ever to be permitted at large. And I love that quote because it speaks to the heart behind the spirit of abolition, what we are doing in trying to fight and eradicate the systematic exploitation, enslavement, and oppression of large demographics of people around the world.
Right. And I feel like the more survivors you ever speak to, the more your heart is connected to the horror and pain and trauma of this issue, the more you're asking the questions, what is it going to take to end this? I don't want a single survivor to ever have to go through the horror and trauma of what happens in prostitution. And so you're asking those questions, okay, let's go further upstream, or looking at the root causes, like what is it going to take to uproot this as much as is humanly possible in our lifetime. A huge part of prevention is going after demand. And I sometimes say to people like, we could assist and rescue 100 girls out of trafficking, but as long as there's demand, traffickers will recruit 100 more girls next week. And so we are so committed to trying to see an ending to this entire industry of exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation, that addressing the demand, it seems obvious, in the business world, the economic world, there's supply and demand. If you want to reduce supply, you study demand. Who are the consumers? How do we shift their patterns or even eradicate that if it's causing harm, if it's a human rights violation? But I remember there being organizations that wouldn't even take part in being on panels with Nefarious because it addresses prostitution.
Right.
So the controversy of addressing prostitution, demand, even pornography is a lot less comfortable for people because it ruffles more feathers of, well, some of these men, they're over 18 and the person that they're purchasing in the sex trade is over 18. So, you're getting into consensual sex is what the argument is from people. And I sometimes explain that the thing about demand is you don't have one group of men who are seeking after a 16-year-old trafficked girl and one buyer who's seeking after an 18-year-old consenting girl.
Right.
They're not asking those questions. They're not. There's not an ethical group of men who form this type of demand, and then a non-ethical demand is the same pool. And of course, there's a spectrum of nefarious behavior and intent within that, and I think that's really important to discuss as well. But we have to address demand and not just categorize it in these two separate boxes. And I really want to see, one of my dreams for the anti-trafficking movement is that more organizations and more individuals have the boldness to talk about demand.
Right. Because the same men that are, these child rescue organizations, their point is, well, we're just going to go out and rescue a bunch of kids and we don't want to do with anything controversial. Well, the same men who are buying those kids are buying the women, and buying the same men buying the women are buying the kids. Like, it's, you can't compartmentalize it like that. We either want to get to the root of this issue or we don't. Like, fighting slavery during Wilberforce's time was not a socially acceptable thing. It was very controversial. There was a lot of stigma. You were swimming against the grain of that culture fighting against an industry that was deeply tied into the economy of their day. And so there was all kinds of resistance to that. And there was a struggle in that. And so, for us, like, that are in this work, the bigger question is not like what is socially acceptable. The bigger question is, how are we going to end this? And and if the answer happens to be controversial, so what? Like, so now you're going to create a whole PR front to get around the controversy to do what? Like, and a person I was talking to who was working in a foreign country told me, they're like, in all the time that I did outreach, I was living in this particular foreign country for this extended period of time. I think it was a couple years or something. It said every person that I had ever met who was working in prostitution during that time had at one point been rescued by this same organization. So they were out rescuing people, putting that on their newsletter. Believe me, I'm like all for people being rescued, but there was no underlying strategy, and these people were just being recycled back into prostitution. And so, that's partly why we love Dom Brewster, we love AIM. They are building, they have a much more holistic program. When girls are rescued out, they have restoration homes, are very effective, and then training them in jobs and things of that nature. But the point, back to the main point, is that at some point you have to get to the deeper root of what is causing this.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to come across as self-righteous, but I just deeply believe that we have to pull this up by the root, even if it's controversial. What is accepted in society is just, it's all over the map. Who cares? Like, what society says is good today is bad tomorrow. And you cannot go by that. You cannot go by pleasing man, the fear of man. Like, we have to be willing to embrace the stigma and the controversy of fighting this injustice if we hope to actually bring an end to it.
Even if it's offensive. And in a way, work that actually pushes the needle is going to be offensive. What I've seen is, it's quite sad. It's a sense of almost hopelessness that can men ever really change? Like, can demand ever really go away? Like, is it even worth addressing that? Like, how do you reduce demand? Like, I've had people really despairing and hopeless and almost like, we're not even addressing that because I don't think, men are always going to want to buy sex. And the truth is that in countries that have really looked into this, researched, put in the criminal deterrence, so the appropriate penalties, partly as a deterrent. I was in Germany over the summer, and they were talking a lot about COVID and how, the Germans are real rule keepers. And I was thinking, that's interesting that they're talking a lot about Germans being rule keepers, but when it comes to legal prostitution, because it's legal, there's zero boundary or deterrent, whereas for a lot of people, they wouldn't choose and engage in behavior if it is illegal. And from countries that have passed the Nordic model, the equality model, the beautiful thing about that law and policy is that it shifts the culture and the mindset. And I've spoken to people in Sweden who was just the first nation to pass this law 23 years ago, and they said, like, the most successful part of this in their minds is the younger generation of boys growing up who see it as a human rights violation. Like, sex and money should not ever go together. If there's any form of payment taking place in a sexual act, then that's coercion, or a form of coercion. You're purchasing someone's consent, and that is not cool. Like, that is considered shameful. And we don't want to use shame as the motivation, but I think it's a really interesting social study on how laws and policies really can shift behavior. So even just from the offset, like, I want people listening to know that it is possible to shift a culture. Yeah. It is possible. It might not happen overnight, but our hope for a film like Buying Her is to bring this conversation into the forefront, like, hear from the very men who this was their story, understanding their story and asking the deeper questions of, okay, so how do we change this? How do we change the culture? How do we change the behavior? How do we understand what led men to becoming frequent sex buyers, and what would have prevented that from happening? Because I really do believe that each one of the men we interview, that lifestyle and that path could have been prevented.
I completely agree that the mindset that this has always been, it will always be, is a very detrimental part of like trying to address this part of the equation. Is just
Right.
the dismissive mentality that lets one off the hook from the vulnerability of having to face the suffering of our sisters and daughters in our world. And it's woven into the fabric and the vernacular of our pop culture. Things like you'll hear things like, "What would you do if you suddenly won $1 million?" Oh, I'd get hookers and blow. Things like that we wink at as part of like the male pop culture, peer culture dynamic, and those are harmful mindsets that are perpetuating the real damage and destruction of people who are in real lived situations. I refuse to believe that that is the end of our story as men. I believe that we are able to shift mindsets and change our way of being in the world. And back to Wilberforce, we stood in front of his physical house in London, England. He was a real man who lived in a real house, who fought a real issue, and actually shifted the locus of thought and the mass consciousness of society of his day. And I just take so much courage from that we can change our perspectives, and that we can live in such a way that is casting our vote for what kind of world we want our children to inherit. What father takes his son to a brothel when they're turned 15? I hear stories like this. Either they don't understand what's going on, or they've been so deeply indoctrinated by the toxic male peer culture. What father, I think, imagines their son growing up to go pay to have sex with people in prostitution? So I just think there's so much more education and awareness that's needed to really help illuminate the realities that are at work in this larger sex industry. I remember sitting down with a woman at a coffee shop in Amsterdam who had been exploited in prostitution for some number of years. And as she was sharing her story with me, there were many traumatic events that had occurred over these period of years. And at one point, she was struggling to find the words to describe like what had happened to her, just as like a human living out this existence. And then she began to weep, and she said, she called me by my first name. She said, "Benji," she said, "I could not love." And she's weeping. And she said, "I could not love. I could not love." And it was almost like a revelation to herself. She just kept saying it over and over. "I could not love. I could not love." And it was this awareness that at a heart level that she had lost the capacity for love. And I thought of this quote by Albert Schweitzer that says, "The tragedy of life is what dies inside a person while they live." And so there's this part of the human experience that to me is like the most beautiful part of our existence, our capacity to love, our capacity to give and receive love, to enter into a love relationship with a parent, with a friend, with a lover, with a dog, with, it's our joy and our dignity and our fulfillment to love. And I thought it was such a powerful thing for her to share that to me, really kind of defined the experience of prostitution. So yeah, just for the fathers out there that are thinking, "I'm going to go take my son to, when he comes of age to see a hooker," what are you signing up for? And you are participating in the destruction of another human being's life, not just physically, emotionally, and spiritually, but literally existentially. As a human, you are destroying that person's capacity to enter into what it means to be human. Like, if we are not haunted by that as a society and as men, that we have participated in perpetuating that reality for large demographics of our sisters and daughters around the world over millennia, this is one of the most urgent issues of our time. And we have to stop playing games around this and stop treating it as though it's just some wink, wink, nudge, nudge issue that we sort of like joke about. Oh, if I ever won the lottery, I'd get some hookers and blow. Like, we have to do away with that mentality, stop indoctrinating each other with that, and start to enter into empathetically to the experience of people who have actually endured prostitution and what that has meant for them and the way that has so severely damaged their lives.
I want to take a moment to tell you about a group that is very special to us. This group has helped us win decisive battles against the world's biggest porn site, compelling them to delete millions of videos suspected of containing criminally abusive content. Through our films, this group has helped change the way millions of people think about porn and the sex industry, inspiring viewers to stop allowing this industry to control their lives and harm others. This group has enabled women and girls bound in trafficking to be reached and offered a way of escape. The group has also helped survivors to find healing through trauma therapy so that they can build a new life. We call this group Abolition Partners, and their monthly donations are foundational to every breakthrough at exoduscry. As a nonprofit, our work is mostly funded by generous people like you with a passion for justice, who believe that together we can change the world. When you become an Abolition Partner, we'll send you a kit with our exclusive Abolitionist t-shirt, a DVD of our documentary on trafficking, Nefarious Merchant of Souls, and you'll get a free ticket to any new film we screen in theatres. Join us on the front lines of this fight and let's uproot trafficking and sexual exploitation from our world. You can get started at exoduscry.com/AP. I feel like people, use the term slavery or sex trafficking as a modern day slavery, and they're thinking at that moment of the traffickers and the mafia and the cartel and like the slave owners being those people. But I remember when I began to hear from survivors that in many ways the exploitation or slave experience was being purchased time after time, day after day, as a disposable sex slave. Like, the dynamic in prostitution is one person with money, the choice, the agency, purchasing access to rent a vulnerable person's body. And we have to talk about it in such clear language because that is what's taking place between one person who is purchasing it, an experience, and one person who does not want that and is inherently experiencing it as violating and exploitative, and the money is buying their silence and compliance. If they even see that money, it may be going to a third party, a pimp, or it's economically they are relying upon it to even survive. And a survivor who I have the most deep respect for, her name's Audrey Morrissey. She's in Boston. She's incredibly brave in describing this element of the long-term impact of prostitution. And she said, because I disassociated every single time I was, my body was purchased for sex, that was how I survived it. I learned how to completely shut my mind off and escape and block it out. But she said, well, after I left prostitution, every relationship I've had, I am not, still to this day, I am not able to be present mentally during, even in a loving relationship, even in a marriage. And it's caused the ending, tragically, of many of these relationships because she says, my brain and my body, there's still a complete disconnect. And she's like, this is something I have to live with the rest of my life. And the trauma, the invisible scars of what prostitution does to the human soul, I think is a really fundamental aspect of understanding this. And I love that in buying her, we're hearing from the sex buyers, but you also interviewed sex trade survivors and asked them really deep and profound questions about their experience in prostitution, hearing it from the other side. And that's one of the most compelling dynamics of the film, is hearing the the male perspective in that moment, in hindsight, and the survivor's perspective of how they've experienced sex buyers. And I think it's going to be enlightening for so many people who've never heard both of those sides of the story.
There's this scene that we filmed in it was, we're recreating like one of the prostitution scenarios that these men described. And we had this road sign in the background that had "satisfy yourself" written on it. And you just see it for a brief moment as the girl's like beginning to undress. The camera racks from her to the sign, and you just see it for a brief moment. It says "satisfy yourself," but it's this subtextual kind of recognition of part of like what's at like the core of the mentality that fuels this idea that I can satisfy myself on someone else's suffering. And it's really, it comes down to a fundamental core lack of understanding what life is really all about. It's not about satisfying ourselves as much as it is serving others and receiving satisfaction through that. It's counterintuitive. There's this idea that's propagated, all throughout social media. There's a whole mentality of like, satisfy yourself. Don't get me wrong. I appreciate the value for self-care, but this preeminent consumption with just satisfying myself leads to things like going out and purchasing self-centered gratification at the cost of somebody else. And I just think at a very fundamental philosophical level, it comes back to a perception of why are we here on this planet and what brings actual true fulfillment. I don't know that there are many people out there, in my experience of talking to these men, who go out and engage in this and then afterwards feel like, oh, this has contributed something to my humanity, to my growth as a human being. And so I think part of, the key is changing our perspective. And part of the way that we do that is through entering into a more empathetic way of being in the world. And to do that, you have to step out of your routine and you have to step out of your normal comfort zone and actually begin to go listen to the stories of people who are in exploited positions around the world. Part of my journey began when I heard John Dawson give a message about I think it was like 28 injustices that women are facing uniquely in these different parts of the world. And one of them was systematic female, mutilation in one part of the world. And then another one was, all rights being stripped away in another part of the world. Can't even drive, And then another part of the world, it was the, normalization of these things where women are abducted and then married. Like, I can't remember the name of it, but it's forced marriages. And so he was like unpacking all of these things. Empathy causes pain to enter our heart, and we have an aversion to pain as humans. But the truth is that we can't be fully alive as humans unless we're willing to embrace the paradox of letting pain enter into our experience. It has some value in our life in helping to guide the way that we see the world and the way that we order our lives. And I remember when we were filming in Amsterdam, so we were going to be interviewing some people and we were doing some filming, but I wanted to go and just meet some of the women who were working behind the windows. There was an organization there that was doing some outreach, and they bring care to these women through soup or, offer some kind of gesture of kindness, comfort to these women. Well, I was invited to go along and to meet some of these women. So this one who was from South America, we knocked on the window. She opened it up to us. She was very happy to see this other person that I was with, this other woman that I was with that was doing this outreach. They knew each other by this time. And so she invited us back into her room. So she closes the door. She closes the curtain. And we sit down on this sort of like makeshift bed that she, works from. And the woman was so happy and open to share her story with us a bit. And at one point, she began to share about how after each client that she either vomits or she wants to vomit after each client. And as she's sharing this with us, she's progressively becoming more and more tender and more deeply aware of her own reality. And she starts to share how, she was brought here from South America, and now she's required to work in this way to send money back for her family, and found herself trapped in the cycle. She grabbed the one lady's hand and she grabbed my hand, and she started to brace herself for just you're going to leave soon and I have to be with another client. And just the realization for her of I do not want to sleep with another strange man. And yet this is my reality that I'm stuck in day in and day out, client after client. So people sometimes ask me, and I know you get asked this question a lot of how do you do this work? And I think, how can I not? When you stare at the reality of people who are suffering this injustice in our world, it only makes sense to dedicate your life to it. And that's part of what has helped me to realize that really life is found in serving others. And every bad decision that I've ever made in my life is a result of satisfying myself. There's no long-term joy or fulfillment or pleasure in just going around trying to make yourself feel good. The real secret key to life, if you want that fulfillment, is serving others. And so I just think that there's not enough men who have decided to really sit and listen to the experiences of people who are in prostitution to realize this isn't something to joke about. These are people's lives who are being destroyed. And for many men, you're participating in it. And now I'm going to be a part of an anti-trafficking organization to fight this, but I'm not going to talk about it because it's too controversial. I'm you need to go find another job. We just need an abolition movement to rise up of people who are authentically connected to the reality of what's going on and are willing to bear the stigma of actually trying to pull this up from the root. It's so not okay that there are 42 million people who are trapped in this injustice around the world.
I think of how it's only because of the courage of survivors to tell us how they are experiencing this that we could even enter into empathy. And I think of the survivor leaders and individuals like Rachel Moran. When we read her book Paid For a few years ago, I know for me that was the closest I'd ever almost entered into the experience of prostitution, because she was so honest. And it's for someone who's never had the experience of being sold in prostitution, it's a hard place to even imagine what that's like. And so I think of that survivor you just met in Amsterdam. I think of the survivors that I've spoken to over the years. Once you really have your ears open to listen, and it's so hard because it disrupts everything. You cannot go back to business as usual once you really have your heart connected to the horror and trauma of someone who is bought and sold and traded, a human being. This is one of the most dehumanizing forms and expressions of misogyny and degradation and harm in our society. And when I do outreach and I see sex buyers, and they're often groups of guys in cars and they shout out the windows, and I feel like I live in these two worlds. You probably feel the same. It's the everyday world that, everyone's just going about their day, and the knowledge that every day there are people in plain sight in our communities, in our cities, who are experiencing this. And for anti-trafficking organizations, and you said earlier, we identify as an abolition organization that means that we're actually wanting to address the root and pull trafficking up by the root. If we're not willing to talk about demand, who is? If we're not willing to talk about what is at the root of this, and I know it can feel oversimplified of like, well, you know, if we end demand, if every man stopped buying women and children in sex today, trafficking would end today. And I know that that's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's a really important mindset for people to even have of like, you want to fight trafficking, make sure you have a value for addressing demand. And we need people from every angle in the prevention space working with men. I hate what the sex industry does to men as well. Like I've worked in red light districts around the world in outreach, and as well as seeing the suffering of women and what it does and seeing in their eyes what is taking place, the sex buyers that I see walking around, like the look in their eyes and the way that the sex industry has dehumanized them. They're walking around acting out in the most like bestial form of themselves. I've been in strip clubs where I've seen men on all fours grunting like animals. And it's been very disturbing seeing what this does to men. And so our hope for this film, I know, is that as well as opening people's eyes to the importance of addressing demand, understanding buyers, but to call men into a place of anger at the injustice, calling them into the fight, like the film gives that invitation. I want every man who watches this film who has a mother, a sister, a daughter, but even if you don't have a single female in your family, you are a human. As a living, breathing human person, open your eyes to the suffering of your fellow sisters in prostitution. And even though, as you say, all the cultural jokes about the sex industry, we need that, like the connection between the horror of prostitution and what is taking place and the hearts of viewers and especially men. And I feel like the film really does convey that more than any other film, because this is the first film on demand.
There's something really powerful about thinking about the idea of like sisters, brothers, sharing this planet in solidarity. And I think that our culture really tries to polarize the distinctions between men and women in ways that cause us to relate to each other in ways that are oftentimes not healthy and are like over-sexualized. And I remember doing some work with my therapist, Harvey Schwartz. He talked to me about this idea of women as sisters. And it was really in his own experience of working with a lot of victims of satanic ritual abuse and victims of human trafficking and the most extreme forms of abuse and complex trauma and PTSD and all of these things. And it was helpful to see that modeled for me, the way that he related to women as sisters, and he would use that language, and it really helped me, and it kind of like deposited something into me. And so when I was in that situation with that woman in Amsterdam, and you know, most men are passing by that window, and what they see is a woman in a bikini who's a sex object. She's there for their pleasure. What they don't understand is what's going on in her life, in her heart, in her mind. And I felt so privileged to be able to be taken back and see this other side of this person. And when she was holding our hands, there was this sort of like desperation in her of not wanting to go back into the reality of what her life would be the moment we left that window. And I just remember feeling this overwhelming urge to like want to just hold her. And there was literally nothing sexual about it. It was just like, I just want to give you a hug. Like, I don't know what to do. I don't know like what the answer is for you in this moment, but I feel your pain from one human to another. And I just wanted to like hold her and as like a brother, you know? And so pulling back from that experience, and I mean, we both have like could go on so many stories about this. I think that it's important for us to be able to see the suffering in our world through that lens of not what can I do to take advantage of the vulnerability of these people to satisfy myself, but how can I be a part of holding that person in their pain, whatever that might look like.
So just even on that note, as you're sharing that story about Amsterdam, I was in Amsterdam over the summer, did outreach there for the first time. I requested, can we give the women roses? Because there's something just always so humanizing and pure and simple about giving a flower, a rose, to a woman. And we were giving them a special invitation to the drop-in center, telling them about the resources available. And they knew that the small team I was with, they go out there every few days. But what was really interesting to me is every time we were talking to a woman through the window, we were breaking this narrative of her as a commodified sexual object. We're treating her like a human. We were humanizing her through talking with her, engaging with her, giving her a rose. And these women are mostly immigrants from Eastern European countries, some of the poorest nations in Europe. They are brought in from there. So it's not Dutch girls for the most part at all in these windows. But what was incredibly, there's so much to say about that. The first time I walked around Amsterdam, even though doing this work for more than a decade now, I still felt struck like someone has punched me in the stomach, seeing women like my sisters being sold behind glass window. I was like, here we are, post the Me Too movement. How is this still happening in our world? But I remember this man coming up to me while I was talking to a woman behind the window, and he started kind of shouting at me and saying, like, you don't need to talk to them. Just let them work. They don't want to be harassed by you. Leave the women alone. And I was like, okay, he's either a pimp or a sex buyer, like one of the two. But we had a few other men like heckling us as well. And one guy was like, well, are you giving gifts to the guys as well? And I was like, well, they're flowers and we've got makeup. Like, these gifts are for the ladies. Are you a lady? And then when I said, are you a lady? He was like kind of backing off. But the other guy who was shouting and saying, like, don't talk to them. They want to work. I could feel that we were breaking this narrative. We were breaking this fantasy, this facade that exists in this beautiful city of Amsterdam, right in that dark red light district. And it breaks the fantasy. And he was threatened by that. And we even had women coming up to us being like, what are you doing? And, are you a religious group? Like, it was just interesting. It was stirring stuff up. And I think that's a really powerful thing I've seen consistently in outreach and in strip clubs, where I remember sitting down with a girl that I had just had a really deep conversation with, and this guy came up and he was like wanting to buy her a lap dance. And I just interrupted and said, and I don't normally do this, but I just said, I looked at the guy, I was like, I just want you to know, this is my friend, and she is one of the most kind, compassionate, funny. I just started talking about her character, and her face kind of lit up. And I just basically humanized the heck out of her in front of this guy by talking about who she really is on the inside, like not this facade of who you see. And she just like had the biggest grin on her face. And we left the strip club. And like 5 minutes later, that guy walked out. We saw him getting into his car. And I think that there was something about just helping the light go on in his mind. Like, this is a real human woman that you just see the fantasy driven by what pornography tells you about women in the sex industry. And you go to a strip club or you go to the brothels in Amsterdam to act out that fantasy. These are real women. And the misogyny behind the sex industry is what drives it. And I think that one of the key principles and solutions to helping shift our culture is helping people understand the real lived experiences of the people being exploited in this industry.
That's absolutely the key. And yeah, I think that the entire global commercial sex industry thrives on and survives and is held together by the notion that these are two-dimensional objects. As soon as you pop that bubble, the fantasy is sort of like burst. It doesn't hold together anymore. And that's why empathy is such a critical part of this. But I wanted to leave off on one story to encourage people that are maybe listening to this, watching this, have connected with our work, how important it is to just step out and begin to be a part of something to try to make a difference. I know I've shared this story before. I've shared it a few times, but we were down in Jaco Beach in Costa Rica investigating child sex trafficking. And we had gone to this place called the Beetle Bar, where it was notorious for child trafficking. And we were there for about 45 minutes undercover. And we weren't seeing any children, so we were getting ready to leave. And I spot this young girl who appeared to be around 12 years old on the other side of the room. And she was dressed the part. The temptation when you see something like that, you can't believe that somebody at that age would even be in this situation. So when you go into some of these places and discover that, it really like has the effect of like just like blowing your mind. Like it feels surreal. And but I saw this other man this very, very large man, spot her at the same time I did. So he's walking towards her, and I see this whole thing unfolding. And so I bolted across the room, and I get there right before he does. I literally step right in front of him, and I'm like, how much to rent your time? And we work out this price, and we end up being able to take her out. And we're sitting at this restaurant across the street, and then we bring our team in, and there's some females a part of our team and a translator. And at one point it felt like it just made sense to ask if I could pray for her. And so she accepted. So I'm praying for her, and as I'm praying for her, tears start streaming down her face. And this girl's, like I said, my best guess is she's 12. She's, just a tiny little thing. And after I'm done praying for her, she steps in front of me and she starts saying something to me in Spanish over and over. And I asked her translator, I said, what is she saying? And the translator said, she's calling you an angel. She's saying, you're an angel, you're an angel, you're an angel. So she's this little thing standing in front of me. She's like 2 feet shorter than me, and she's looking up at me with these eyes, and she's saying this thing in Spanish, very determined. And I'm like, and then when the translator said it, I was like, in my head, I didn't really understand why. And I was like, ask her why she's telling me I'm an angel. And she said, so asked her, and the girl said, well, because tonight was my first night and he was my first customer. And I felt like God sent him here for me. And just the realization in that moment that we had no great, brilliant plan or strategy. We just went to try to observe what was going on to help shine a light on this, and found ourselves in a situation where we were actually intervening on behalf of somebody who was about to be trafficked. And so I wanted to share that story just in ending this conversation to encourage people that, neither of us went to anti-trafficking college. Neither of us, went to the job fair that was how to get a career in fighting human trafficking. Something happened in our heart that was awakened to this issue. And as we began to step out, we began to see positive momentum. We began to experience real human connection. And now looking back over these past 15 years, we can see the way in which our weak yes, our humble just putting one foot in front of the other has resulted in bringing about so much change into so many people's lives. And there's still so much work left to be done. But I wanted to share that because I think that sometimes the barrier to entry in this field feels high, like people don't know how to get involved. And I think it's just, just a one simple yes. And I truly believe that our weak effort will be matched by God's power, strength, and anointing to help bring hope and healing and deliverance to those who are in exploited positions.
You can check out all our podcast episodes, articles, and films at exoduscry.com and join the daily conversation by following Exoduscry on all major social platforms.